Ever wondered why there are so many bars, restaurants, cafes, small shops in and around the cities that are empty for ages? Me too. I'm Jason Weeks, I'm the co-founder of Endurable.com, and this is a question that I commonly hear from friends and family, and so I've decided to do a little video to explain why these places are for lease, for let, for rent for such long periods of time. Most of these assets are owned by individuals or trusts, and they will have debt against them. And this is an interesting thing because when you borrow money from someone, it's not free, you pay interest, and there's almost always conditions attached. So the conditions that are attached to the purchase of an asset, particularly ones that include debt, are most often covenants around whether you're paying the interest, and then importantly, what the value of the asset is. And what the value of the asset is matters because if the loan becomes too high a proportion of the value of the asset, then typically you'll find that the bank will ask you to either refinance with somebody else because they're not interested, or they'll ask you to tip in more money to bring down the debt as a percentage of the asset. So let's use an example. If I purchase a property for $1 million, let's say it's a cafe, and that cafe is paying me $100,000 worth of rent a year, and the bank says, I will lend you 50% of the value of the asset. They will lend me $500,000. Then the LVR, the loan to value ratio, is 50%. So it is $500,000 divided by $1 million, what I purchased the property for, 50%. So that's our LVR, our loan to value ratio. But the interesting thing is the value of the asset, the $1 million I paid, is only commensurate with the cash flow that I get from the property, the $100,000 of rent a year from the cafe owner. So let's say 6 months in, all's fine, but actually the cafe owner doesn't want to be there anymore and they quit and they sack their staff, cancel the lease, and they move out, and now the property is vacant. So I now get a broker or an agent, I get someone to try and let the property, and I test the market. And the market for new cafes, new restaurants or bars, someone coming in, unfortunately is around the $80,000 a year rent mark, which might be why our original cafe owner left. The market has dropped. If I accept that lease as a landlord, then I've accepted $80,000 a year rent. Now, the value of the asset being derived from the value of the cash flow has fallen because originally I could get $100,000 rent a year and now I can only get $80,000 rent a year. So what's the asset worth? Well, if we use a rate of return, a cap rate, then let's say we use the original cap rate we had, which was we paid $1 million and we were getting $100,000 a year rent. So the cap rate was 10%, or $1 million on $100,000 10 times, or $100,000 on $1 million value 10%. So our new investment in that property has actually fallen from $1 million to $80,000 divided by the cap rate, 10%, $800,000. Big problem. We've just seen our asset fall from $1 million down to $800,000, and so has the bank, which means they look at that and they say, well, we were happy to lend you 50% of the value of the asset. The asset is now no longer worth $1 million, it's now worth $800,000, and so we're only willing to lend you $400,000. So there are two ways that you can deal with this as a landlord or an owner. The first is you will have to refinance with someone else who will be willing to lend you $500,000 on $800,000. Or the bank says, well, you've been a great borrower from the bank, we're happy to keep you, but you'll have to put in $100,000 worth of equity, and then we'll reduce the value of the loan to $400,000, and $400,000 on $800,000 value is 50%, our original agreed LVR. Now, if we look at that scenario from a landlord's perspective, that's a terrible result. They've seen their annual rent drop from $100,000 to $80,000, so a 20% drop, and they're being asked by the bank to tip in $100,000 of equity to bring the value of the loan down. So what do most landlords do? Well, most landlords will typically wait, and they will wait until they can find a tenant who is willing to pay $100,000 a year or better in rent so that they can maintain the value of their asset and not have to put in the extra money that the bank would require them. Now you might say, well, if they can't get the rent, won't the bank actually just devalue the asset anyway? And the answer is no. A lot of assets are not comparable with each other, And unless there's sufficient market rent around for the bank to request a revaluation, which may be possible at certain time intervals, but not always, and usually not within a year period, then the landlord might wait 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 months. They might sacrifice the rent of 6 months because that is better than having to put in $100,000 of their own money, and it's certainly better than having a $20,000 a year drop in annualized rent on top, which, don't forget, is usually for multiple time periods, multiple years, because that's what the new lease will be. And so the landlord will wait. They will sit on it, and they will wait until the property is able to be rented for an amount that is commensurate with what they originally purchased the asset for. Now, how can we stop landlords from doing this? Well, obviously, there are a number of disincentives for holding empty assets, things like council rates, property upkeep, because of course you can't let a property get too derelict. Even if it is empty, it needs to be cleaned, usually security, etc., etc. And there'll be land tax and perhaps other state or federal charges associated with the property, depending on what jurisdiction you're in. So there are disincentives for landlords to hold assets for long periods of time vacant, but they're often not great enough for the asset to be relet quickly. Landlords are incentivized to wait, and they are incentivized to wait because they have borrowing against an asset. If you see an asset that is vacant for long periods of time, it may also be that the particular entity it's being held in has gone into bankruptcy, either individual, personal, or company. And with that in mind, those processes can take anywhere from 2 to 3 years to work their way through the system, and as a result, the property is not leased, either because individuals are trying to ascertain who controls an asset, and therefore they don't want to lease it. It may create an issue, and tenants are usually nervous to go into an asset that is part of an insolvency proceedings because there's uncertainty around control and whether that lease will be honoured, or whether the asset will be sold to a new owner, which may then cause a change of control. All of that to say, debt and its associated outcomes, both with banks or recoveries and ownership, is a large reason as to why these properties are empty for large periods of time. I'd love to hear your thoughts, comments below, and I'll bring you something new in the next week or so that might have been a burning question. If you've got them, drop them down below. Thanks.